Hello. A few weeks ago, one of the wood-turning forums that I participate in on the internet, a fellow came on and he had a request to see if anybody would be interested in turning him some of these. Now these are tuning pegs for ukuleles. We did explain to him that turning something like that by hand would take a fair bit of time with the, if you include the initial stock preparation and get it mounted on the lathe and stuff like that. Nobody in their right mind would pay what you would have to charge to say you made a profit on that. So he understood that, but he was hoping that somebody, who did it as a hobby might be interested in making some. He wanted about 100 of them. But he later said that the only reason he said 100 was because he didn't think anybody would be interested in a smaller quantity. But so I kept going back and looking at that picture and thinking, how would I turn something like that? And I guess I got kind of hooked. And I decided, I got in contact with him and said I'd give it a try. So he did send me some detailed drawings with measurements to 3 decimal places on what he was looking for. So I thought I'd give it a try. Then I had to figure out how I was going to do that. And I decided that in order to minimize waste, the best idea would be to start with a fairly wide board and plow opposing grooves, which would become these finger grooves. This particular piece was my test piece, I guess. Those grooves are not right, but so I set up a core box bit, a 1-inch diameter core box bit on my router table, and I cut some blanks to the length I thought would work, and I plowed semicircular dados into them to try and duplicate the finger grooves in those. And then I laid out, and I did it on both ends so that I could have one peg with the button on this end going that way and one peg with the button on that end going this way in my stock. And then I could cut triangles or wedges in between them to try and minimize the waste. So this is one of the blanks that I came up with. And I thought I'd show how I turned them. So the one reason I decided to take it on was because I was kind of curious as to how I would go about it and whether I could make 100 pieces that were relatively similar. So and it also looked like a very good project to use the skew chisel And practice with the skew is always a good thing in my mind. So when I had, while I had the board like this, I used a marking gauge to strike a center line on the end grain on both ends. And then once I had cut the wedges, I measured the width and laid out and put a dimple in on center. I guess I better start bringing you in a little closer. So that gives me center on the wide end. The small end is going to be held in the chuck and will be more or less self-centering, depending on the thickness of the stock. And I don't want that live center for this job. Okay, so what I do is I slip the small end of the wedge or triangle into the chuck and just close it until the two jaws that are on the thickness of the piece are making contact. And that locates that end initially. Now at this point, the taper is smaller than the thickness. So I just kind of eyeball center there and crank that in a bit. Depending on the angles of the wedges, it might make contact with these outside pieces, but for the length I need, I'm not going to be, it would eventually, but for the length I need, I'm not going to be able to go in that far, so I just kind of eyeball the gap on here and try and make them equal and tighten the chuck. I'm holding this end on with that dimple on the live center point to keep it centered while I'm tightening the chuck. And the amount of off center, if like there's a very small gap, maybe a 32nd of an inch or less between these two jaws and the sides of the wedge, eyeballing those gets that centered close enough, because I'm going to be taking material off here and it's going to be round in relation to whatever center it's turning on. So I want to use a short tool rest, and I want to bring the height up because I'm going to be using a skew chisel for this. And once I've tightened the chuck, then I just give the tailstock ram hand wheel about a quarter of a turn to drive that point somewhat deeper into the wood, just to give the piece more support side to side. And now I'm ready to turn. Bring that in a little closer. Oops, I'm losing the end there. Now, one of the dimensions I'm trying to hit is the width of the button. And that dimension from the drawings is 0.7 0.85 or so inches. That's not necessary. That is not critical that it be within the thousandths of an inch, but it's got to be close enough that if two pegs are side by side, they look similar. So I am very close to that now. And when I am turning the shape of the button, I'll be turning from here down this way and then from here down that way. So I'll have to blend those curves together out here, and I'll probably be taking off a little more material there, so I'm going to say that's fine for the width of the button right now. I have removed material from both sides, so those edges are radiused. So now I want to start shaping the shank or shaft or whatever you want to call it. So I'll make a plunging V-cut and widen it. Okay, now the idea of that is when I'm removing material here, I don't want it to splinter back into this area. So this is more or less a stop cut. So any wood that I'm removing here will splinter ahead to there and just stop, and it won't splinter into this part. And by the same token, I just make a quick cut there to keep it from splintering back into the chuck. And I'm not necessarily going for my finish diameter at this point on this section. I'll worry about that a little later. I just want to bring it down to round. And it's round now. So now I'll start working on shaping the top of the button. So again, a little V-cut. Then I roll the skew over a bit and make an angled peeling cut. Down into there. And then I'll start shaping the top of the button. Okay, so what I'm aiming for there is to make sure that the diameter at the point where this cove meets the edge, that diameter is less than the original thickness of the piece, so there's no flats left on at that point. So that's looking good there. So now I'm going to size the shank, and normally I would use something like an open-end wrench for that. Unfortunately, I don't have an open-end wrench that gives me the size I want, so I just made a notch in the end of this stick. The problem with that is that this is wood, and using it quite a few times, it tends to start getting a little wider there. So this stick is pretty much actually worn out. It's giving me a larger shank than I want. So I know I need to take, once I get down to that size, I know I still need to take a little more off. If I was not done, or just about done, I would make a new stick. Okay, so I have sized it in 3 places, and I can just take the waste material off in between. And I know that I'm going to have to take a little more than what that stick says, so okay, I'm going to actually check that. And that diameter is it's still somewhat bigger than I want. So I'm going to take a little more there. Now these will become tapered eventually. He is purchasing a shaver, a peg shaver, which I guess works something similar to a pencil sharpener to shave them to the taper that they need to be. There's no way I could match the taper at long distance by hand, just freehand cutting. So that's not bad. That's 0.350. I was heading for somewhere between 340 and 350. So that's reasonably good. That is what I want at the top end of the peg. This will eventually be tapered, so what it is down here at this point, as long as it's bigger than it needs to be, it really isn't important. So now I'll start shaping the bottom side of the button. And get rid of some of that waste. Alright, so now I want to stop and check to make sure that I have eliminated any flats at this end, and I have. I think I need to take a little more out here to have that curve flow properly, and then I need to undercut a bit at the base. Alright, and this is the only point where I use a gouge. Very narrow point on the gouge to make a small cove right there. And I'll get rid of this waste here. And I just have a set of dividers set to the length I want, the total length. Score a line down here. Use a narrow parting tool. to part it the rest of the way off. So that, alright, that's not... So there's a completed peg from my perspective. It still needs to be shaved to a proper taper, and he will be dyeing them. This material I'm using is hard maple, that's what he specified. And that's a completed peg. So I have a few here. And there are variations, of course. If you're working freehand, there's always going to be variations, but the variations, if you have a large enough quantity of pegs, you can kind of sort through and find the ones that are the most similar. A ukulele takes 4 pegs, so if you've got 100 pegs, you can sort through and find the ones that are most similar to use. I have a whole bunch of pegs now, and they're not all identical, but they're all quite similar, and there are enough of them that if he sorts through, I'm sure he could find... He only uses 4 on each instrument, so I'm sure he could find sets of 4 that are close enough to each other. So that's what the finished pegs look like. So that was just showing how I did it. Again, that's not necessarily the only way it could be done, and I don't even say it's the best way to do it. I don't know. It's the way I came up with, and it worked. So I guess that's the main thing. I got the pegs turned, and the customer was quite happy with them. And it was an interesting project to work on, to puzzle out how to do it, and it gave me quite a bit of practice with the skew chisel. So thank you very much for watching.